27 World Series championships, more than double any other franchise in baseball history. The New York Yankees weren't just a baseball team. They were an empire. For generations, the pinstriped uniform struck fear in Whitey Ford. The names alone told the story of baseball's most dominant dynasty. Other teams had stars. The Yankees had constellations. Other teams retired numbers. The Yankees retired so many legends, they ran out of single digits. From 1949 to 1964, the Yankees won 14 American League pennants in 16 years. 9 World Series championships. They didn't just win. They were expected to win. Anything less was considered a failure. The Yankees didn't just beat you, they demoralized you. They made you feel like losing to them was inevitable. That's what made them the Yankees. But in 1966, the unthinkable happened. The New York Yankees finished last, not second to last, not somewhere in the middle of the pack, dead last. 10th place in a 10-team American League, 26.5 games behind the Baltimore Orioles. It was the first time the Yankees had finished in the cellar since 1912, back when they were still called the New York Highlanders, back before Babe Ruth had ever worn pinstripes, back before Yankee Stadium even existed. The franchise that had defined excellence for half a century was suddenly, shockingly, the worst team in the league. How did baseball's greatest dynasty fall so far, so fast? This is the story of 1966, the year everything went wrong. To understand how the Yankees collapsed, you have to understand what they had built. The 1964 Yankees were champions. They won 99 games. They captured the American League pennant. They went to the World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals. On paper, the roster was loaded with future Hall of Famers and recent most valuable players. Mickey Mantle was 32 years old, still considered one of the most dangerous hitters in baseball despite the knee injuries that had plagued him since his rookie season. Roger Maris, who had broken Babe Ruth's single-season home run record just 3 years earlier, was 29. Elston Howard, the catcher and 1963 most valuable player, anchored the lineup with his steady bat and gold glove defense. Whitey Ford, nicknamed the chairman of the board for his cool demeanor under pressure, led the rotation. At 35, he was still crafty enough to dominate hitters with guile when his fastball wasn't there. They had young arms like Mel Stottlemyre, who arrived in August and immediately looked like a future ace. Jim Bouton had won 21 games the year before. Al Downing was a hard-throwing lefty with electric stuff. The rotation seemed set for years. They had gold glove defenders at nearly every position. Clete Boyer at third base was considered the best in baseball at his position. Bobby Richardson at second was steady and reliable. Tony Kubek at shortstop completed one of the finest infields in the game. The 1964 team looked like it could dominate for another decade. But the World Series ended in a 7-game loss to St. Louis. Mickey Mantle hit 3 home runs. Bob Gibson struck out 9 Yankees in the decisive Game 7. The Cardinals won. The Yankees went home. And what nobody realized at the time was that it would be the last World Series the Yankees would play for 12 years. The cracks were already forming. You just had to know where to look. The first warning sign came in 1965. The Yankees finished 77 and 85. A losing record. It was their first since 1925. 40 years of sustained excellence, suddenly over, but the Yankees convinced themselves it was a fluke. An off year. Too many injuries at the wrong time. They would bounce back. Spring training in 1966 was filled with optimism. Sports Illustrated wrote that the Yankees had more question marks than a true-false quiz, but predicted they would return to the first division. The roster still featured Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris, Elston Howard, Whitey Ford, names that had dominated baseball for over a decade. Manager Johnny Keane, who had led the Cardinals to victory over the Yankees in that 1964 World Series, was now in his second year in pinstripes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had beaten them was now supposed to save them. But Keane walked into a situation nobody could have fixed. The veterans weren't just aging, they were falling apart. Mickey Mantle had been playing hurt for years. His knees, ravaged since a drain cover injury in the 1951 World Series, required constant attention. The Yankees trainers wrapped both knees in heavy bandages before every game just so he could take the field. The story of that injury had become legend. Mantle was a rookie, playing right field alongside Joe DiMaggio in center. Willie Mays hit a fly ball between them. DiMaggio called for it at the last second. Mantle tried to stop, but his spikes caught on an exposed drain cover. His knee twisted horribly. He collapsed to the ground like he had been shot. The injury tore his anterior cruciate ligament. In 1951, there was no surgery to fix it. Mantle played the next 17 years of his career without a functioning ACL in his right knee. Every time he swung the bat, every time he ran the bases, he was doing it on a knee that could barely support his weight. He compensated by developing massive leg muscles, by taking cortisone shots, by wrapping his legs so tightly the circulation was nearly cut off. He played through pain that would have ended most careers, but 1966 brought new problems. Bone chips in his shoulder, a torn hamstring running the bases. At 34 years old, the man who had once been the fastest player in baseball could barely run. Mantle was limited to just 108 games. He didn't play at all after September 18th. He still hit 23 home runs with a .288 average, respectable numbers for most players. But Mantle wasn't most players. He was supposed to carry the team. Instead, he could barely carry himself to the plate. Throughout his career, Mantle's determination to play through constant pain had been legendary. 4 knee operations, osteomyelitis that nearly cost him his leg as a teenager. He played when he should have been in the hospital. He played when doctors told him to rest. But in 1966, even Mantle's legendary toughness wasn't enough. The body was finally giving out. The Mick was mortal after all. If Mantle's decline was gradual, Roger Maris's collapse was sudden and bitter. Maris had never recovered from the brutal 1961 season when he chased Babe Ruth's home run record while the New York media tore him apart. His hair fell out in clumps from the stress. Fans booed him for daring to threaten the Babe's sacred record. Sports writers questioned his worthiness, pointing out that he was hitting in an expanded 162-game season, while Ruth had only played 154. Commissioner Ford Frick, a former ghostwriter for Babe Ruth, declared that if Maris broke the record after game 154, it would require a distinctive mark in the record books. They called it the asterisk. Even when Maris hit number 61 on the final day of the season, it felt like a hollow victory. The stress changed him. Maris had always been reserved, uncomfortable with the New York media spotlight. But after 61, he withdrew completely. He stopped talking to reporters. He gave one-word answers when forced to speak. The press turned hostile in response. By 1965, the physical toll caught up with the mental anguish. Maris broke a bone in his hand and needed surgery. The operation was successful, but it left him without full strength in that hand. His power was gone. Then in 1966, things got worse. He collided with Tigers catcher Bill Freehan at home plate and injured his knee. He complained that his hand was still bothering him, that he couldn't grip the bat properly, that something was wrong. The Yankees didn't believe him. The front office and the fans questioned whether Maris was really hurt or just didn't want to play. They pressured him to take the field. Some whispered that he was soft, that he couldn't handle the pressure of playing in New York. He did what they asked, struggling through a miserable season while his hand screamed in pain. The numbers told the story. He finished with a .233 batting average, 13 home runs, and 43 runs batted in. This was the same player who had hit 61 home runs just 5 years earlier. The same player who had won back-to-back MVP awards in 1960 and 1961. Only after the season, when Maris was traded to the St. Louis Cardinals, did the full truth emerge. He had played most of 1966 with a broken bone in his hand that the Yankees' medical staff had failed to diagnose. The team had questioned his toughness while he was literally playing through a broken hand. The trade itself was an insult. Roger Maris, two-time American League MVP and single-season home run champion, was sent to St. Louis for Charlie Smith, a journeyman third baseman. Nobody. The baseball world shook its head. Los Angeles Times columnist Jim Murray wrote that the Yankees didn't really trade Maris. They uncaged him. Maris would later say he never would have returned to New York. He called it 7 long years. The Cardinals welcomed him with open arms. He helped them win the 1967 World Series while the Yankees continued to sink. The pitching staff was in no better shape. Whitey Ford, the chairman of the board, had been the ace of the staff for over a decade. His 236 career wins were the most in franchise history. His .69 winning percentage was the best among modern pitchers with at least 150 victories. In World Series play, he held the record for consecutive scoreless innings, surpassing even Babe Ruth. Ford was not overpowering. He never threw particularly hard, but he was smart, crafty, and utterly unflappable under pressure. Mickey Mantle once said he did not care what the situation was, how high the stakes were. The bases could be loaded and the pennant riding on every pitch. It never bothered Whitey. He pitched his game. But Ford was 37 years old and had developed a terrifying problem: circulatory issues in his pitching shoulder. The blood was not flowing properly to his left arm. His hand would go numb. He could not feel his fingers. For a pitcher who relied on location and touch, it was potentially career-ending. He had undergone surgery after the 1964 season. Dr. Denton Cooley, the famous heart surgeon, performed a sympathectomy designed to keep the capillaries open. It allowed Ford to pitch in 1965, but he had to delay between pitches, sometimes 15 or 20 seconds, waiting for the blood to travel down his arm. He could only sweat on one side of his body. One half would be drenched, while the other stayed dry. Ford joked about it. He said he was the only ball player who could get 10 days out of a 5-day deodorant pad. In 1966, the problems returned, and Ford needed another surgery in August. Surgeons took an artery from his thigh and inserted it under his shoulder without disturbing it. It was a complex, delicate procedure. He finished the year with 2 wins and 5 losses and a 2.47 earned run average. The numbers looked decent until you realize he could barely pitch at all. He started only 9 games. The chairman of the board was done. He would retire the following May, his arm finally giving out completely after one final start in Detroit, where he lasted just 1 inning. At his retirement press conference, Ford held back tears. He told reporters that the job was much tougher than he ever thought it would be, but that he had no complaints. He said he came in wearing a $50 suit, and he was going out wearing a $200 suit. So that was pretty good. Then there was Jim Bouton. Bouton had been the future of the Yankees pitching staff. In 1963, at just 24 years old, he had a record of 21 wins and 7 losses with a 2.53 earned run average. He made the All-Star team. He threw a perfect inning in the Midsummer Classic. His 20th win clinched the pennant for the Yankees. His delivery was unforgettable. Bouton threw with such violent effort that his cap flew off after nearly every pitch. It became his trademark. The kid with the cap flying off, throwing blazing fastballs past American League hitters. In 1964, Bouton led the American League with 37 starts. He won 18 games. He threw 2 complete games in the World Series, including a 6-hit shutout of the Cardinals. With Bouton, Mel Stottlemyre, and Al Downing complementing the veteran Ford, the Yankees appeared to have their rotation set for the next decade. Or so they thought. The heavy workload destroyed his arm. The Yankees had used Bouton relentlessly. 37 starts in 1964 alone, 271 innings. His young arm simply could not handle the strain. In 1965, Bouton's fastball disappeared. He went 4 wins and 15 losses with a 4.82 earned run average. The zip was gone. The snap that had made his pitches so unhittable simply was not there anymore. He would later describe it like stretching a rubber band too far. It never gets its elasticity back. The ball was still traveling fast, but it wasn't moving. It didn't have that life, that late action that made hitters swing under it. In 1966, Bouton's earned run average bounced back to 2.69. He was pitching better, locating the ball, getting outs. But his record was just 3 wins and 8 losses because the Yankees couldn't score runs for him. His days as a hard-throwing ace were over. Bouton would eventually reinvent himself as a knuckleball pitcher, scratching out a few more years in the majors with the Seattle Pilots and Houston Astros. He would become famous for writing Ball 4, the controversial tell-all book that scandalized baseball and made him a pariah among former teammates. But in 1966, he was just another injured pitcher on a broken team, watching his career slip away. The managerial situation made everything worse. Johnny Keane had seemed like a masterstroke when the Yankees hired him. He had just managed the Cardinals to a World Series championship over the Yankees themselves. He had decades of experience in the St. Louis organization. He knew how to win. But Keane was a minor league lifer who had spent most of his career developing young players, not managing established veterans with egos and championship rings. The Yankees players viewed him as an outsider. They resented his motivational techniques, his old-school methods. Jim Bouton later wrote that Keane was prone to panic and would sacrifice a season to win a game by playing injured stars before they were ready. The relationship between Keane and his players deteriorated quickly. In 1965, the Yankees finished 6th, 25 games out of first. It was their worst finish in 40 years. Keane returned for 1966. The Yankees started the season 4-16, 4 wins, 16 losses. It was the worst start in franchise history. On May 7th, Keane became the first Yankee manager fired mid-season since 1910. He was replaced by Ralph Houk, the former manager-turned-general manager who had led the team to 3 straight pennants from 1961 to 1963. But even Houk could not save this team. He went 66-73 the rest of the way. The Yankees still finished last. The story took a tragic turn that winter. In January 1967, Johnny Keane died of a massive heart attack at his home in Houston. He was just 55 years old. Mickey Mantle would later say he was ashamed at the way the players had let Johnny down. Most of the other Yankees expressed similar regret. But by then, it was too late. Behind the scenes, the front office was in chaos. The Yankees had been sold to CBS in August 1964. The broadcasting giant paid $11.2 million for 80% of the team, eventually acquiring the remaining 20%. It was a controversial deal. Many wondered whether a corporation that made television programs could successfully run a baseball team. The answer would prove to be no. Dan Topping, the former owner, stayed on as president under the new arrangement. But he was overmatched without a strong baseball executive at his side. Ralph Houk had been promoted to general manager, but his expertise was on the field, not in the front office. CBS grew nervous as the team declined. They brought in Michael Burke, one of their own executives, to oversee operations. Burke was a colorful character. He was a former OSS agent during World War II, later a CIA operative, and an executive at Ringling Brothers before joining CBS. He wore tailored suits from Rome. He knew nothing about baseball. On September 19, 1966, Dan Topping resigned and sold his remaining share to CBS. The network that had purchased a dynasty now owned a last-place team. CBS would continue to struggle with the Yankees for years. They eventually sold the franchise to George Steinbrenner in 1973 for $8.7 million, less than they had paid almost a decade earlier. One of the few times in sports history that a major franchise was sold at a loss. The farm system had dried up. For decades, the Yankees had used their money and their prestige and their nationwide scouting network to sign the best young players in the country. If you were a talented teenager with dreams of playing in the major leagues, the Yankees came calling, and most of them said yes. Who would not want to play for the greatest franchise in sports? Tom Greenwade, the legendary scout who discovered Mickey Mantle in a zinc mining town in Oklahoma, had built his career finding future stars. The Yankees did not just sign good players, they signed the best players, and they did it year after year after year. But in June 1965, baseball implemented the amateur draft. Now every team would select players in order, with the worst teams picking first. The playing field was leveled. The Yankees could no longer simply outspend their competitors for talent. They could not rely on the mystique of the pinstripes to lure young players away from other organizations. They had to build through the draft like everyone else. And their early drafts were not impressive. The young players who had shown promise in the early 60s failed to develop as expected. Joe Pepitone had power but not consistency. He could hit 30 home runs one year and disappear the next. Tom Tresh could not replicate his Rookie of the Year season. Phil Linz became more famous for playing the harmonica on the team bus than for anything he did on the field. Bobby Mercer, a young shortstop from Oklahoma who had been signed by the same scout who discovered Mickey Mantle, showed genuine talent. The comparisons to Mantle were inevitable and perhaps unfair. Mercer was drafted into the Army after the 1966 season and would not return to the majors until 1969. 2 crucial years of development were lost to military service. Thurman Munson, who would become the heart and soul of the next great Yankees team, the captain who led them back to glory, was not drafted until 1968. He would not arrive in the Bronx until 1970. The pipeline that had sustained the dynasty for decades was empty, and it would take years to fill it again. The season reached its symbolic low point on September 22nd. It was a Thursday afternoon, a dreary, rainy day in New York. 5 inches of rain had fallen that morning, breaking a 30-year record. Most people assumed the game against the Chicago White Sox would be postponed. The stadium was wet. The forecast called for more rain. There was no reason to play. It wasn't cancelled. The attendance that day was 413 in a stadium that held 65,000, the smallest crowd in Yankee Stadium history. A stadium built for Babe Ruth, where Joe DiMaggio roamed center field, where Mickey Mantle had launched tape measure home runs, now sat nearly empty on a miserable Thursday afternoon. By the end of the game, only about 100 fans remained. They rattled around in the vast, empty stadium like ghosts. Red Barber, the legendary broadcaster who had called games for the Reds, the Dodgers, and now the Yankees for over 30 years, knew what he was witnessing. He had been there for the glory days and the pennant races. He had called World Series games. And now he was watching the death of a dynasty. Barber asked his television director to pan the empty seats. The director refused. Perry Smith, the Yankees' head of media relations, had ordered no shots of the empty stadium. CBS had just taken over the team 2 days earlier. The last thing they wanted was images of their investment looking like a ghost town. But Barber was still a reporter. He said on the air, "I don't know what the paid attendance is today. But whatever it is the smallest crowd in the history of Yankee Stadium. And this smallest crowd is the story, not the ball game." He was right. It was the story. It perfectly captured everything that had gone wrong with the Yankees in 1966. 1 week later, the new team president, Michael Burke, invited Red Barber to breakfast at the Plaza Hotel. Barber thought he was going to discuss a new contract, perhaps even a role advising the new ownership about personnel decisions. Instead, Burke told him that they had decided not to renew his contract. Red Barber, one of the founding fathers of baseball broadcasting, the man who had introduced the game to millions of radio listeners, the voice of Jackie Robinson's rookie season, was fired for telling the truth. He never called another regular season baseball game. He would eventually be inducted into the broadcaster's wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. But his days behind the microphone were over. The Yankees had silenced him. The final record was 70 wins and 89 losses, a .440 winning percentage. They finished 26.5 games behind Baltimore. The Orioles went on to sweep the Los Angeles Dodgers in the World Series just to rub salt in the wound. The Yankees scored 611 runs and allowed 612. They were outscored by 1 run over the entire season. Statistically, they should have been closer to a .500 team, but the intangibles were gone. The clutch performances that had defined Yankee baseball for generations disappeared. The confidence, the swagger, the expectation of victory, all of it evaporated. For the first time since anyone could remember, the Yankees were just another team. Worse than another team. They were the worst team. The aftermath was painful. Roger Maris was traded to St. Louis for Charlie Smith. He won a World Series ring with the Cardinals in 1967, then helped them return to the Fall Classic in 1968. He retired happy, far from the New York media that had tormented him. Clete Boyer, the Gold Glove third baseman, was traded to Atlanta. Bobby Richardson, the steady second baseman who had been part of 7 World Series teams, retired at just 31 years old. Tony Kubek had already retired after 1965 due to a bad back. Elston Howard, the first black player in Yankees history and a beloved figure in the organization, was traded to Boston in August 1967. The indignity of seeing Howard in a Red Sox uniform told longtime Yankees fans everything they needed to know about the state of the franchise. Mickey Mantle moved to first base in 1967. His knees too damaged to play the outfield. He struggled through 2 more seasons before finally retiring in March 1969. Whitey Ford announced his retirement on May 30, 1967. Holding back tears, he told reporters, "I'm positive I'm doing the right thing. But I wish I could have played a few more years to be part of the rebuilding program." The rebuilding program would take much longer than anyone expected. The years from 1965 to 1973 became known as the Horace Clarke era, named not for a star but for a solid, unspectacular second baseman who symbolized the mediocrity that had overtaken the franchise. The Yankees wouldn't finish above .500 until 1968. They wouldn't seriously contend until 1970, when they won 93 games, but still finished 15 games behind the Baltimore Orioles. They wouldn't return to the World Series until 1976, 12 years later. The resurrection required George Steinbrenner, who bought the team in 1973. It required free agency and homegrown talent like Thurman Munson and Ron Guidry. But all of that was a decade away in 1966. That year, the only story was collapse. What killed the Yankee dynasty? The simple answer is injuries and age. Mickey Mantle's knees, Roger Maris's hand, Whitey Ford's shoulder, Jim Bouton's arm. When multiple Hall of Fame caliber players break down at the same time, no team can survive. But the deeper answer is institutional failure. The Yankees had grown complacent. They had relied on their name and tradition to attract the best players. When the amateur draft ended that advantage, they were not prepared. They had sold the team to CBS, a corporation that knew television but not baseball. They had allowed their farm system to atrophy while other organizations invested in player development. The Baltimore Orioles, who won the 1966 World Series, had done everything the Yankees failed to do. They built for the future while competing in the present. The Yankees had rested on their legacy, and in 1966, that legacy finally ran out. There is a photograph from that September 22nd game, the one with 413 fans, row after row of empty blue seats stretching toward the outfield, a handful of people scattered throughout the cavernous stadium, the upper deck completely deserted. It is almost impossible to believe this is Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, the cathedral of baseball, the place where legends performed before sellout crowds for 40 years, the stadium that visiting players spoke of in hushed tones, the stadium that made grown men nervous just walking onto the field. But the photograph tells the truth. By the end of 1966, the Yankees were not legends anymore. They were losers. They were a last-place team playing out the string in front of nobody. The greatest dynasty in baseball history had hit bottom. It would take a decade to climb back. The story of the 1966 Yankees is a cautionary tale about the danger of believing your own mythology, about what happens when you stop adapting, stop developing, stop planning for the future. The Yankees had won so much for so long that they forgot how hard winning actually was. They assumed the pinstripes alone would carry them through. They assumed that being the Yankees was enough. They learned the hardest lesson in sports. Nobody stays on top forever, not even the Yankees. But they would rise again. Steinbrenner's money, Munson's leadership, Jackson's October heroics, Guidry's left arm. By 1977, they were champions once more. The dynasty that died in 1966 was eventually reborn. Different players, different owners, different era, but the same pinstripes, the same stadium, the same expectation of excellence. That's what makes the Yankees the Yankees. They do not accept mediocrity. 1966 was their worst year in half a century. A complete collapse, but it was also the beginning of something new. The first step back to glory. The Yankees had to rebuild, and eventually they did. 413 fans watched a meaningless game on a rainy September afternoon in 1966. 10 years later, 56,000 packed Yankee Stadium to watch the team clinch its first pennant in over a decade. The dynasty had returned, but first it had to die. Like and subscribe for more baseball content. Until next time.